The snow fell in thick curtains across the Ardennes forest, each flake a whisper of cold that settled on blackened metal and frozen earth. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber pressed his gloved hand against the frosted viewing port of his Tiger I, watching the tree line with eyes that had seen too much. The engine rumbled beneath him like a sleeping beast, and he could feel the vibration through his boots, through his bones. 3 years of war had taught him to trust that rumble, to believe in the 88mm gun that extended before him like the finger of God himself. "Command says they're pulling back again," said Corporal Hans Dietrich from the loader's position, his breath forming clouds in the cramped interior. The heating system had failed 2 days ago, and none of them mentioned it anymore. Complaining changed nothing. Another wave of Shermans tried to push through at Bastogne, burned like matches every one. Friedrich didn't respond immediately. He was watching a farmhouse in the distance, its roof collapsed under artillery fire, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes that looked like acne scars on a teenager's face. Someone had lived there once. Someone had probably died there too. The mathematics of destruction had become so routine that he barely registered it anymore. But today, something felt different. The air tasted wrong, metallic and sharp, like biting down on aluminum foil. "How many?" he asked finally. 12 confirmed kills between our platoon and 2nd Company, Hans replied, and there was pride in his voice, the kind that came from survival rather than glory. "The Americans keep sending them. Same tactics, same results. It's like they don't learn." But Friedrich knew better. The Americans learned. They learned fast and they learned well, adapting their tactics with a flexibility that the rigid German command structure could never match. What worried him wasn't their stupidity, it was their abundance. For every Sherman they destroyed, 3 more appeared on the horizon. For every American tanker they killed, a dozen more rolled off ships in England, fresh-faced and terrified and absolutely certain of their eventual victory. The radio crackled to life, startling all of them. Static hissed like a nest of snakes before Captain Mueller's voice cut through, sharp and authoritative despite the distortion. "All units, maintain defensive positions along Highway 7. Intelligence reports enemy armor movement, company strength, approaching from the northwest. Tigers 1 through 4, hold the crossroads. Do not, I repeat, do not advance beyond your current positions." Friedrich acknowledged the order and settled back into his seat, feeling the familiar weight of command settle onto his shoulders like a lead blanket. His crew had been together since Normandy, the survivors anyway. Original driver Klaus had taken shrapnel to the throat outside Caen, replaced by young Otto Reinhardt, who was 19 and lied about being 18. Gunner Stefan Vogel had been with him since training, a clockmaker's son from Munich who could thread a shell through a needle at 2,000 meters. Radio operator Ernst Fischer rounded out the crew, a philosophy student who quoted Nietzsche at inappropriate moments and kept a battered photograph of his sweetheart tucked inside his helmet. They were good men. They deserved better than this frozen hell. "Do you think the war will be over by Christmas?" Otto asked from the driver's compartment, his voice carrying the hope of someone who still believed in endings. It was December 18th, 1944. Christmas was a week away, an impossible distance measured in blood and steel. "Which Christmas?" Stefan replied with dark humor, and Ernst laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Friedrich allowed himself a thin smile. Morale mattered, even now, especially now. "Keep your minds on the task. The Americans won't wait for holidays, and neither can we." He climbed out through the commander's hatch, needing to see the battlefield with his own eyes rather than through the narrow slits of the tank's vision ports. The cold hit him immediately, stealing his breath, turning his exhaled air into fog. The Tiger sat at the edge of a small rise, positioned behind the burned-out remains of an American half-track that provided partial concealment. Around them, the forest spread in all directions, pine trees heavy with snow that muffled sound and limited visibility to less than 400 meters in most directions. Captain Mueller's command, Tiger, was positioned 200 meters to his left, partially hidden behind a stone wall that had once marked a farmer's property line. Tigers 3 and 4 covered the southern approach, their hulls dug into defensive positions that made them nearly invisible from the road. It was a good setup, a killing ground. Any American column that rolled down that highway would be caught in a crossfire that would shred them within minutes. But something nagged at Friedrich's mind, an instinct honed by too many close calls and narrow escapes. The Americans had been predictable lately, almost suicidally so, throwing their Shermans against German armor in frontal assaults that ended in fireballs and screaming. It had made them cocky, his fellow tankers, certain of their invincibility. The Tiger was the king of the battlefield, they said. The Sherman was a coffin on treads, they said. The Americans called their own tanks Ronsons after the cigarette lighter, lights first time, every time. But predictable enemies were dangerous in their own way. They made you comfortable. They made you stop thinking. He was about to climb back into the tank when he saw it, movement along the northern tree line, barely visible through the snow. Not the rumbling approach of armor, but something quieter, more deliberate. Infantry, maybe? Or scouts. He raised his binoculars, adjusting the focus, squinting through the falling snow. There. A figure in white winter camouflage, moving between trees with practiced efficiency. Then another, then 3 more. American infantry, almost invisible against the snow, using the forest cover to advance in a wide skirmish line. They were good, better than the usual conscripts. These moved like veterans, like men who knew what they were doing. "Contact," Friedrich said into his throat microphone, keeping his voice calm and level. "Infantry, northern approach, approximately 800 meters, multiple targets." "Confirmed," Captain Mueller responded immediately. "Hold fire until armor reveals itself. We don't break position for foot soldiers." It was the right call tactically, but it felt wrong emotionally. Those men were advancing toward their position, potentially marking their locations for artillery or calling in air support. The Allies owned the skies now, their thunderbolts and typhoons screaming down to strafe anything that moved. The Tigers were powerful, but they were also slow, and a well-placed bomb could crack them open like walnuts. Friedrich watched the infantry disappear into the trees, and unease coiled in his stomach like a snake. Something was happening, something beyond the usual patterns. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the snow seemed to fall heavier, in the quality of the silence that pressed against his ears. "Load armor-piercing," he ordered, dropping back into the tank. "Stefan, track the northern approach. Ernst, monitor all frequencies. I want to know what they're saying." "On it," Ernst replied, adjusting his radio set, cycling through American frequencies. Most of it would be encrypted or in code, but sometimes they got careless, especially forward units in contact. Hans slammed a shell into the breach with practiced efficiency, the metallic clang echoing in the confined space. The smell of gun oil and unwashed bodies filled the air, mixed with the faint odor of gasoline and the metallic tang of fear sweat. Nobody mentioned the fear. Nobody had to. Minutes stretched into eternities. The snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, covering everything in a blanket of deceptive peace. Friedrich's hands were cramping from the cold despite his gloves, and he flexed them repeatedly, forcing blood back into his fingers. The Tiger's gun was trained on the highway, waiting, always waiting. Then Ernst stiffened, pressing his headphones tighter against his ears. "I've got something," he said urgently. "American armor, multiple units moving up Highway 7. Wait, they're talking about... I don't understand. They mentioned Tigers, but they sound confident, too confident." "How many?" Friedrich demanded. "At least a company, maybe more. But boss, they're not scared. Every other time, the Americans sound terrified when they know Tigers are in the area. These guys sound like they're going hunting." The unease intensified, becoming almost physical. Friedrich had learned to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming danger. But orders were orders, and their position was strong. They had the advantage of terrain, concealment, and firepower. The Americans would come down that highway, and they would die, just like all the others. Except something was different this time. The first sound of engines reached them, the distinctive whine of American tanks, higher pitched than diesels, unmistakable even through the snow. Friedrich pressed his eye to the gun sight, watching the road appear in segments through the trees. His heart was hammering now, adrenaline sharpening his senses, making everything hyper-real and impossibly clear. "Range, 1,200 meters," Stefan reported, his voice steady, professional. "Multiple targets emerging from the tree line." And there they were, rolling into view like toys on a conveyor belt, Shermans as expected, their angular holes and short-barreled 75mm guns immediately recognizable. Friedrich counted 6 in the lead formation, spread in a textbook advance with good spacing and mutual support. Behind them, more shapes emerged through the snow, the column stretching back into the trees. "Wait for the command," Friedrich said quietly, forcing himself to breathe slowly, to stay calm. But something caught his eye, made him pause. The lead Sherman looked wrong somehow. Its profile subtly different from the thousands he'd seen before. The turret seemed larger, the gun longer, and it moved with a confidence that made his skin prickle with warning. "Stefan, do you see?" The world exploded. Not in the expected direction, not from their position, but from the Sherman column. The lead tank's gun flashed, a tongue of flame lancing through the falling snow, and Friedrich's mind had just enough time to register that's not a 75mm before Tiger IV erupted in a massive fireball, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary explosion that sent the turret cartwheeling through the air like a thrown toy. Impossible. Shermans didn't kill Tigers from the front. They couldn't. The mathematics of armor penetration didn't allow it. The 75mm gun on a standard Sherman couldn't punch through a Tiger's frontal armor at anything less than point-blank range, and even then it was doubtful. It was a fundamental truth of the battlefield, as reliable as gravity. But Tiger IV was burning, and the crew wasn't getting out. "All units, fire at will!" Captain Mueller's voice crackled over the radio, the careful calm shattered by urgency and something that might have been fear. "Engage immediately!" Stefan already had the lead Sherman in his sights, his hands moving with the precision of long practice. "Target acquired! Fire!" The Tiger's 88mm gun roared, the recoil rocking the entire tank backward on its suspension, the muzzle blast clearing snow in a perfect circle around them. Through the scope, Friedrich saw the round impact, a perfect hit on the Sherman's frontal plate, exactly where it should have punched through the armor like a fist through wet paper. The Sherman kept coming. Not possible. Not even remotely possible. No tank in the American arsenal could withstand a direct hit from a Tiger's main gun at this range. But even as Friedrich's mind struggled to process what he was seeing, the Sherman's turret rotated with mechanical precision, and that two long guns zeroed in on their position. "Reverse!" Friedrich screamed. "Otto, reverse now!" The driver reacted instantly, the Tiger lurching backward even as the Sherman fired. The shell passed through the space they'd occupied a second earlier, close enough that Friedrich swore he could feel the displacement of air, the heat of its passage. It impacted the burned-out half-track behind them, detonating with a crack that made his ears ring. "What the hell are they shooting at us?" Hans shouted, already loading another round, his movements frantic now, the careful training giving way to panic. "I don't know," Friedrich admitted, and that admission was more terrifying than anything else. In 3 years of war, he'd always known his enemy, understood their capabilities and limitations. The Americans had numbers, they had logistics, they had air superiority, but they didn't have tanks that could trade blows with Tigers. That was the one advantage Germany still possessed, the one edge that made up for being outnumbered and outgunned everywhere else. Except now that advantage was burning along with Tiger IV's crew. Around them, the other Tigers were engaging, their guns thundering in rapid succession, filling the air with smoke and cordite and the screaming of shells. Through the chaos, Friedrich could see more of those modified Shermans advancing, their longer guns tracking and firing with a precision that spoke to experienced crews and superior optics. Another Tiger was hit, this one's track blown off, immobilizing it but not destroying it. Its gun kept firing, desperate now, the crew knowing that they were finished but determined to take someone with them. The battle had become a slaughter, but for the first time in Friedrich's experience, the Germans were the ones being slaughtered. "Stefan, aim for the turret ring," Friedrich ordered, forcing his voice to stay level, to sound like he knew what he was doing. "Weak point, has to be." "Trying," Stefan replied through gritted teeth, his hands making minute adjustments to the gun's elevation. "They're moving too fast. These aren't standard Shermans, boss. They're moving like they know what they're doing." And they were. The American tanks were using terrain, using cover, bounding from position to position with a coordination that suggested extensive training and battlefield experience. These weren't the green crews they'd been facing in the early days of the invasion. These were veterans, men who'd learned their trade through blood and fire and survival, and now they were hunting tigers with a confidence that bordered on contempt. Friedrich made a decision that went against every instinct, every order, every tactical doctrine. "All crew, prepare to abandon tank. Otto, plot us an escape route through the southern woods. We're pulling back." "We're running?" Hans asked, disbelief and shame mixing in his voice.
"We're surviving," Friedrich corrected, and hoped it was true. "These tanks, whatever they are, they're killing tigers. Captain Mueller's burning. Tiger 3 just lost its gun. We stay here, we die here. Move!" The Tiger lurched forward, Otto pushing the engine to its limits, the transmission groaning in protest as they pivoted away from the highway and toward the relative safety of the forest. Behind them, the battle continued, the sounds of destruction painting a picture that Friedrich didn't need to see. The Americans were winning, and they were winning with a weapon that shouldn't exist, with a capability that every German tanker had been assured was impossible. As they crashed through the underbrush, branches scraping against the armor like fingernails on a coffin lid, Friedrich realized something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't just a new tank. This was a paradigm shift, a fundamental change in the balance of power. If the Americans had Shermans that could kill tigers, then the entire German defensive strategy in the West collapsed. The Tiger units were the mobile reserves, the shock troops meant to plug gaps and destroy breakthroughs. If they couldn't perform that role, if they were just bigger targets, they were already losing the war. Everyone knew it, even if nobody said it out loud. But there had always been the comfort of technical superiority, the knowledge that German engineering was superior, that their tanks were better, even if they had fewer of them. That comfort was burning on Highway 7. Ernst's voice interrupted his dark thoughts. "Boss, I'm picking up American radio chatter. They're calling it the Easy 8. Some kind of upgraded Sherman with a 90mm gun. They've had it for months, apparently. We just didn't know." 90mm. Friedrich's mind raced through the ballistics, the penetration values, the terrible mathematics of armor warfare. A 90mm gun would have comparable penetration to the Tiger's 88. Maybe not quite as powerful, but close enough that at combat ranges it wouldn't matter. And the Americans could mount it on a Sherman chassis, which meant they could produce them in numbers that Germany could never match. "How many?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Unknown. But they're talking about deploying entire battalions. Boss, I think we've been fighting the wrong war. We've been so focused on the 75mm Shermans that we didn't realize they'd upgraded." And whose fault was that? Intelligence failure, command failure, or maybe just the inevitable result of a war machine that was running on fumes and desperation, too proud to admit that the enemy might innovate, might adapt, might actually be smart. They drove for another 10 minutes, putting distance between themselves and the slaughter until Friedrich finally ordered Otto to stop in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines. The silence after the engine cut was profound, broken only by the sound of falling snow and their own harsh breathing. Friedrich climbed out of the tank, his legs shaky from adrenaline and cold. Around him, his crew emerged like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn. They'd survived, but survival felt hollow when measured against the burning tigers they'd left behind. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "What now?" Stefan asked, and he looked young suddenly, stripped of the veteran's confidence by the simple fact of fear rediscovered. Friedrich looked back the way they'd come, toward the battle they'd fled, toward the future that was rushing at them like a freight train. In the distance, he could still hear the sounds of combat. Fewer guns now, the shooting sporadic and desperate. "Now," he said quietly, "we report what we learned. We tell them that the Americans have a gun that can kill tigers. We tell them that everything we thought we knew about this war just changed." He pulled out his map, checking their position, plotting a route back to friendly lines. The snow was falling harder now, covering their tracks, erasing evidence of their passage. In a few hours, it would be like they were never here at all. Except for the burning tigers. Those would remain. Monuments to ignorance and pride, and the terrible price of underestimating your enemy. As they prepared to move out, Friedrich took one last look back toward Highway 7. Somewhere out there, American tankers were celebrating their victory, probably shocked by how easy it was, how quickly the invincible tigers had burned. They didn't understand yet that this was just the beginning, that the war still had months to run, that thousands more would die before anyone admitted defeat. But they'd learned something today, those American crews. They'd learned that they could win. They'd learned that German armor could burn. They'd learned that the myth of invincibility was just that, a myth. And that knowledge, Friedrich thought, might be more dangerous than any 90mm gun. "Mount up," he ordered, climbing back into the commander's hatch. As the Tiger's engine rumbled back to life, Hans asked one more question, his voice barely audible over the mechanical noise. "Do you think we'll see them again? Those new Shermans?" Friedrich didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the look of those tanks, the confidence with which they advanced, the precision of their fire. He was thinking about how many factories America had, how many workers, how much steel and determination and industrial capacity. "Yes," he said finally, as they pulled out of the clearing and headed east, toward uncertain safety and certain defeat. The snow continued to fall, and somewhere behind them, the burning continued too.
3 days before the battle at Highway 7, Friedrich Weber had been thinking about coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz mixture of roasted grain and chicory that passed for it nowadays, but the genuine article, dark Brazilian beans ground fresh, brewed strong, served in his mother's good porcelain cups with real cream and sugar. The kind of coffee that had filled their Munich apartment every morning when he was a boy, when the world made sense and war was something that happened to other people in history books. The memory was so vivid he could almost smell it, almost taste the bitter complexity on his tongue. Then Stefan had dropped a wrench on the Tiger's deck plate, and the metallic clang had shattered the reverie like a bullet through glass. "Sorry, sir," Stefan said, not sounding particularly sorry. He was lying on his back beneath the tank's engine compartment, his uniform stained with oil and grease, his hands raw from the cold, despite the gloves. "This damned fuel pump is seized again, 3rd time this week." Friedrich knelt beside the tank, looking at the mechanical gut spread across the tarp they'd laid on the frozen ground. The Tiger was a magnificent machine when it worked, a masterpiece of engineering with its overlapping road wheels and thick armor and devastating gun. But it was also a temperamental beast that required constant maintenance, constant attention, constant prayers to whatever gods watched over mechanical systems. "Can you fix it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Stefan could fix anything. It was why he was still alive. "Define fix," Stefan replied, his voice echoing from beneath the tank. "I can jury-rig something that'll get us another 50 kilometers, maybe 100 if we're lucky and gentle. But properly repair it? not without parts we don't have and won't get. That was the reality of the German war machine in December 1944, breaking down faster than it could be repaired, held together by ingenuity and desperation and an increasingly thin veneer of professional competence. Friedrich had stopped being surprised by it months ago, had stopped feeling the anger that came from watching superior equipment wasted through logistical incompetence and strategic idiocy. Now, he just felt tired. He stood up, brushing snow from his knees, and looked around the temporary camp they had established in a farm's barn 3 kilometers behind the front lines. The structure was mostly intact, though shell damage had left a hole in the roof large enough to drive a jeep through. His crew had made it as comfortable as possible. Sleeping rolls laid out on straw, a small stove rigged from a fuel drum, their personal belongings arranged with the careful organization of men who owned almost nothing. Otto was writing a letter home, his lips moving silently as he formed the words, censoring himself as he went. You couldn't tell family about the reality of the front line, about the cold and fear and random death. You wrote about the camaraderie, the beauty of the French countryside, the hot meals, mythical, and good spirits, lies. You wrote the letters that would comfort them after you died, because at 19, you were already thinking about legacy. Ernst sat apart from the others, reading a battered copy of Thus Spake Zarathustra, his lips occasionally moving as he memorized passages. The book had been with him since university, had traveled through 3 years of war, through France and Russia, and back again. The pages were water-stained and dog-eared, held together by devotion and muscle memory. Hans was sharpening his knife, the steady scrape of steel on stone, a meditation, a reminder that some skills transcend machinery and technology. He'd grown up on a farm in Saxony, had learned to butcher pigs and chickens before he learned to read. Now he loaded shells that weighed more than a child and killed men he'd never met. But the knife sharpening remained, a connection to a simpler time. These were his men, his responsibility. The weight of that settled on Friedrich's shoulders like a physical thing, making him straighten his spine, roll his neck to work out the perpetual tension that lived there. Take a break, he told Stefan, who was cursing quietly under the tank. You've been at it for 6 hours. The fuel pump will still be broken in an hour. That's exactly why I need to keep working, Stefan replied, but he slid out from under the tank anyway, accepting the implied order. His face was smudged with grease, his eyes red-rimmed from fatigue. We get called up and this bastard won't start, we're dead. Simple as that.
We get called up and the Tiger works perfectly, we might still be dead, Friedrich countered, sitting down on an ammunition crate and pulling out his own letter-writing supplies. A pad of paper that was running low, a pencil worn down to a stub, a photograph of his family that was creased from repeated folding and unfolding. The photograph showed his parents standing in front of their apartment building, his father in his school teacher's suit, his mother in her Sunday dress. His sister Greta stood between them, frozen at age 15, even though she was 19 now, working in a munitions factory in Nuremberg. They were smiling in the picture, caught in a moment before the war had consumed everything, when the future still seemed like something that could be planned for and anticipated. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in his mother's careful handwriting, "Be safe. Come home. We love you." The date was from 1941, a lifetime ago, when the war was still an adventure and victory still seemed inevitable. Friedrich had never been good at writing letters. His father was the wordsmith, the one who could craft sentences that sang and soared. Friedrich's talents lay elsewhere, in the practical, the tactical, the immediate problem-solving that kept men alive from one day to the next. But he tried anyway, because his mother kept every letter, and someday, if there was a someday, they would matter. "Dear Mama and Papa," he began, then stopped. What could he possibly say? That he was fine? That the war was going well? That he expected to be home soon? All lies, comfortable and expected, but lies nonetheless. He started over. "Dear Mama and Papa, I hope this letter finds you well and warm. The weather here is cold, but we manage. My crew remains in good spirits, and we take care of each other as you taught me. Truth and lies, mixed together in equal measure. Yes, the weather was cold. Yes, his crew had good spirits, or at least as good as could be expected. But taking care of each other, what did that mean when caring meant keeping someone alive long enough to die in a different battle? Otto looked up from his own letter, catching Friedrich's eye. The young driver smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look even younger than his 19 years. Writing to your parents too? Trying to, Friedrich admitted. You'd think after 3 years it would get easier. It gets harder, Ernst said, without looking up from his book. The longer you survive, the more you have to not say. Eventually the letters become pure white space, emptiness dressed up as communication. Cheerful as always, Ernst, Hans said, testing his knife's edge against his thumb. You know, some people manage to be philosophers without being depressing about it. Some people haven't spent 3 years watching humanity reveal its true nature, Ernst replied mildly. Nietzsche understood, the abyss gazes also into you. We've all been gazing into it for too long. Friedrich returned to his letter, forcing himself to write something, anything. I think often of home, of the chestnut trees along Ludwigstrasse, of Sunday dinners and Mama's Sauerbraten. Tell Greta I'm proud of her work at the factory. Tell her to be careful with the machinery. I know she's stubborn, but some risks aren't worth taking. The irony wasn't lost on him, advising his sister to be careful while he commanded a tank in a losing war. But family meant different things to different people, and for Friedrich, it meant maintaining the fiction that normal life still existed somewhere, that there was a world beyond the frozen fields and burning vehicles. A commotion outside interrupted his writing. Raised voices, the sound of boots on frozen ground, engines in the distance. Friedrich was on his feet immediately, his body responding before his mind fully processed the sounds. Around him, his crew reacted with the same trained efficiency, hands moving to weapons, eyes toward the door. Captain Mueller appeared in the barn entrance, his face grave beneath his cap. He was an older man, nearly 40, a career officer who'd spent the interwar years teaching tactics at military schools. The war had aged him faster than the calendar suggested, etching lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke of too many decisions and too many consequences. "Lieutenant Weber," he said formally, and Friedrich's stomach sank. Formal address meant orders, and orders lately meant death. "Briefing in 10 minutes. All tank commanders. Make sure your crew is ready to move on short notice." "The Tiger's down for maintenance," Friedrich reported, hating how the words tasted like excuses. "The fuel pump needs replacing." "Then replace it or bypass it," Mueller said sharply. "Intelligence reports American armor movement in Sector 7. We're forming defensive positions along Highway 7. Your tank needs to be operational." "Yes, sir," Friedrich replied, because there was nothing else to say. Mueller nodded and moved on to the next tank crew, spreading the same message, the same urgency. Stefan was already sliding back under the Tiger before Friedrich could say anything. "I heard," the gunner said. "Give me 4 hours and a miracle."
"You have 2 hours and whatever parts we've got," Friedrich replied, then softened his tone. "Do your best. That's all any of us can do." The briefing took place in the farmhouse's kitchen, which had been converted into a makeshift command post. Maps covered the table, marked with red and blue symbols that told the story of retreat and consolidation, of defensive lines drawn and redrawn as the American advance pushed inexorably eastward. Mueller stood at the head of the table, using a ruler to point at specific locations. "Gentlemen, the situation is straightforward. American forces have been conducting probing attacks along our entire line. Intelligence suggests they're preparing for a major push towards Bastogne, trying to break through before we can reinforce." Friedrich studied the map, noting the terrain, the road networks, the potential approach routes. Highway 7 ran through a natural choke point, flanked by forest on both sides, good defensive ground if they had enough time to prepare positions properly. "How many tanks?" asked Lieutenant Krauss from Tiger 3, a nervous man who'd survived Normandy through luck rather than skill. "Estimates suggest company strength or more, mostly Shermans as usual. The Americans have been throwing their armor at us with abandon, accepting casualties that would be unthinkable for us. Their advantage is numbers and logistics. Ours is quality. Quality. The word hung in the air like a prayer or a curse. The Tiger was qualitatively superior to the Sherman. Everyone knew that. German guns could penetrate American armor at ranges where American guns couldn't touch German steel. It was mathematical fact, battlefield gospel, the one advantage that made up for being outnumbered 5-1 or 10-1 or worse. Rules of engagement? Friedrich asked, already knowing but needing to hear it confirmed. Standard defensive doctrine, Mueller replied. Let them close to effective range, no more than 1,200 meters. Engage from concealment. First rounds are critical. Every kill preserves ammunition and reduces their numerical advantage. Questions? None of the officers spoke. They'd done this before, would do it again, until they didn't. Good, Mueller said. Move your tanks into position by nightfall. Maintain radio silence until contact. Make every shot count, gentlemen. For Germany. For Germany. They echoed, but Friedrich heard the hollowness in their voices, the rote repetition of words that had lost their meaning through overuse and betrayal. Back at the barn, Stefan had performed his miracle. The Tiger's engine rumbled to life, rough and uneven, but functional. The gunner emerged from under the tank, covered in even more grease, wearing a grin of triumph that made him look like a mischievous child. Bypassed the fuel pump entirely. Rigged a gravity feed from the reserve tank. It's not elegant and will lose about 20% efficiency, but it'll run. You're a genius, Friedrich said, and meant it. How long until we're combat ready? Ammunition's already loaded, guns zeroed. Just need to top off the fuel, what's left of it, and we're good to go. Otto had secured fuel from somewhere, probably through the informal barter network that sustained armies more effectively than official supply chains. He poured it carefully into the Tiger's tank, each liter precious, each gallon representing mobility and life and the ability to fight one more day. Hans organized their personal gear, making sure everything was stowed properly, that nothing would come loose during movement. Ernst checked the radio, verifying frequencies and testing communications with the other tanks in their platoon. They worked together with the practiced efficiency of long familiarity, each man knowing his role, performing it without orders or discussion. This was what survival looked like. Attention to detail, preparation, the small rituals that kept chaos at bay. As evening approached and they prepared to move to their defensive positions, Friedrich gathered his crew for what had become his own ritual. They stood in a circle beside the Tiger, the massive tank looming behind them like a protective parent.
Listen, Friedrich said quietly. You all know the odds. You know what we're facing. I won't insult you with speeches about glory or duty or any of that propaganda nonsense. We're here because we're here, and tomorrow we'll fight because that's what we do. He looked at each of them in turn. Stefan with his oil-stained hands and clever mind. Hans with his farmer's strength and steady reliability. Otto with his youth and frightening courage. Ernst with his philosophy and dark humor. But I need you to understand something, Friedrich continued. Every decision I make, every order I give is about keeping us alive. Not about killing Americans, not about holding ground, not about winning the war. About survival. We take care of each other, we trust each other, and we come through this together. Understood? Understood, they replied in unison. And Friedrich saw something shift in their expressions. Relief, maybe, or recognition. They'd all been thinking the same thing, but hadn't dared say it out loud. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, even if admitting it meant treason. The only war left was personal, individual, measured in heartbeats and breaths in the next sunrise. Good, Friedrich said. Mount up. Let's go take position. The drive to Highway 7 took 2 hours, navigating through forest paths barely wide enough for the Tiger's bulk, avoiding main roads where American artillery observers might spot them. The tank moved with surprising grace for its size, Otto coaxing it through tight spots with patience and skill. They arrived at their assigned position just as full darkness fell, the winter night dropping like a curtain, absolute and cold. Using minimal light, they maneuvered the Tiger into a hull-down position behind the burned-out American half-track, angling the armor to maximize protection, ensuring clear fields of fire while